Afternoon and welcome to the Storage Doc. I am Dan Barber. I work with Reliant Technology as a senior data center architect, and this is the next episode of the Storage Doc where we have people call in, WebEx in, ask their storage questions, common questions that we get a lot on customer calls, general area of storage networking or storage devices, anything that is storage related, that's what we're talking about. So today's topic is storage networking. What do I need to know about storage networking? What are some of the common things that you hear about when it comes to SAN design? Everybody listening to this probably already knows, but a storage network is how you connect your servers to your storage device so that you can actually make use of the raw terabytes that you have and put information on them. And so we're going to talk about that today just for a few minutes here. And we've got a couple of questions lined up. And our first question today is from Brian. Hi, Brian.
How are you doing?
Good.
Hey, my question for you is, I currently have a 4 gig fiber network for my SAN. If I upgrade that to 8 gigs, am I going to get better performance?
Yeah, that's a great question, Brian. We get this question a lot, and part of it is because 8 gig's been around for a while, and customers are they bought 4 gig maybe 3 or 4 years ago, and now that 8 gig is gone mainstream and prices have come down significantly, they're wondering, hey, am I going to get better performance if I upgrade to 8 gig? And the answer to that is it depends. Like most things that I say, that's usually my first answer. It depends. The first thing that you need to look at when you're considering upgrading your bandwidth is how much are you actually using now? So are you saturating 4 gigs of bandwidth or are you not? So first, think about it like a transition from fast Ethernet to gigabit. Okay, when we moved from 100 megs per second to 1,000 megs per second, there are a couple of benefits, and one is reduced latency in communication. So even if you weren't necessarily using 100 megabits per second on a line, you upgraded to 1,000, you got better response time. Well, the same thing is going to generally be true if you upgrade to 8 gig. You're going to get generally better response time because the storage processors on the SAN itself and all those things are newer. The SFPs are newer. They're lower latency. All of that. So you're probably going to get a little bit quicker response, but we're talking about milliseconds and microseconds of response as opposed to 1 minute versus 10 seconds. So it's not as much of a difference there. The other question. The other side to consider is, am I using the full 4 gigs per second now? And for most customers, that's probably a no. In general, it takes about 2 to 3 gigahertz of processing power to consume 1 gig per second. So kind of if you do the raw math on that, if you've got say a 4 gig per second line, and you need that, and if 1 gig equals, let's say, 2 gigahertz of processing power, to get 4 gigs, right, you need 8 gigahertz. So that's 8 gigahertz of sustained CPU usage that you'd have to have just to pump up one of these to full line speed. And then on top of that, you've probably got more than just one to your SAN. You've probably got, if you're like most people, you've got switch 1 and switch 2, and let's say here's your SAN, right? And you run 1 or 2 lines here and 1 or 2 lines here, and each one of these is at 4. Add that up together, you're talking about really you need like 32 gigahertz of sustained power to be saturating the whole thing together, because most of your SANs are doing load balancing and things like that. So that's a lot of power most people really aren't going to get there, Brian, but it's hard to say. One of the things that I would encourage you to do is to do some monitoring. Not just at your SAN, but do some monitoring of your switches and in your software to see what kind of line rates you're actually pushing through a sustained level. Not just bursting, because everybody's going to burst, like say during a backup or something like that, but sustained. What are you getting sustained at this level? My guess would be, 1 to 2 at the most for most people. So, in that case, 8 gigs per second is not going to help you a whole lot. And in some ways, just adding more 4 gigabit per second equipment is actually going to help you more. It's going to give you more bang for your buck. So that's just something to think about. So I hope that answers your question, Brian. With that, we can move on to the next one. I think the next question we have is from Jason. Jason, what can we do for you today?
Hey, Dan. Thanks for having me today. How you doing?
Good. How are you doing?
Doing great. Hey, I wanted to know what are one or two of the most important questions to ask when purchasing a director class chassis-based SAN switch?
That's a great question. So we get a multitude of customers who call in and say, I've got maybe 3 or 4 or 5 switches, and I'm considering consolidating those into 1 or 2 kind of core director class chassis switches. So if you're not familiar with that, a chassis switch basically houses, say, you can have it can be horizontally, or it could be vertically as well, but it houses, any number of slots, and it puts in those what are called line cards into each slot, and it functions together as one big switch instead of having, say 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 standalone switches. So the problem with having standalone switches, multiple standalone switches like this, is you have to link them all together. So you have a switch that has, 24 ports on it. Well, you have to take 4 ports from this one, and 4 ports from this one, and 4 ports from this one, and 4 ports from this one to link all those switches together to make them function like a single switch. So ultimately, you lose a lot of your available ports just connecting switches together, and the link between these switches is fairly slow. Whereas if you're using a director class switch, which is housed in a chassis, the links go a lot faster in between the switches. So a couple things you'll want to ask when you're looking at chassis-based switches. One is, what is the bandwidth of the slot? Okay, so you'll see chassis and they'll be rated for, let's say this is rated for 1 terabyte per second, or 4 terabytes per second, or 8 terabytes per second in some cases. Okay, well that's great. What's the actual bandwidth per slot? That means if I've got a server plugged in here and a server plugged in here, how fast can these 2 ports communicate, right? Because that's something that you're worried about a lot. If you're already on this model over here when you're with your fixed switches, what you're really trying to do is alleviate not communication within the switch, but communication inter-switch. So how fast can I go from here to here? That's something you want to find out, because that's the bandwidth of the slot. The second thing you want to look at is how do I upgrade these slots? Do I have to replace, say, something that's called a supervisor module, or a control module, or some kind of other crossbar or something that's in here that connects these all together? Do I have to replace that to move up to the next level, or what's the upgrade path with my chassis? Because that's going to talk about your longevity. You would expect that a chassis switch is going to be more upgradable than a fixed port switch, because you're going to have this a lot longer. So that's something that you're going to want to think about as well. And the third thing that you're going to want to think about is the software features. Okay, and that's a lot of where I would say where people don't really look at it. They look at the hard bottom line cost of the whole solution, right? Most of the cost of a chassis switch is in software and slot bandwidth. That's most of your cost. Okay, between these two things, that's where you're gonna. That's the difference in the features versus a Cisco and a Brocade or whatever. So those are the things that I'm going to look for. I'm going to look for what are the software features, what's the bandwidth per slot, and what's my upgradability of that switch. Of course, there are other things that you're going to want to look at, like does it have enough slots? If I want to combine 6 switches, I probably don't want to get a 4-slot chassis, right? I probably want to get like maybe a 9-slot chassis. The power requirements. These guys, it take multiple power supplies, and how do those power supplies work? If one power supply fails, let's say I got 2 power supplies in this. If one power supply fails, do I lose half my slots? How does that work? So just ask some good questions about these as you're looking at them to make sure you understand how the transition is going to affect moving from a fixed port to a chassis-based switch. So, Jason, I hope that answers your question. And it's actually related, I think, to our next question, which will be the last one we'll take for today, and that is from Leanne.
Yes, I would like to know the primary differences between the Cisco, Brocade, and Force10 chassis switches.
Okay. Yeah, so there's a lot of differences. And so I'm not going to be able to touch them all, Leanne, but I'm going to ask you, or not ask you, but I'm going to try and explain the basic differences. So the question, again, for those of you, if you didn't hear it, is what are the main differences between Cisco, Brocade, and Force10 chassis switches? So these are probably the big 3. Cisco and Brocade would really be considered the biggest. Force10 is relatively new. What are the main differences between the 3 of them? So when you go out and you're looking for a chassis switch, there's a multitude of options. How do I know which one's the best for us? So let's talk about something everybody wants to know about. Cisco, Brocade, and Force10. All right. So cost, Force10 is going to be the lowest entry-level cost. Brocade's going to be middle. Cisco's going to be high. Why is that? Well, that's going to be, again, because of what I was talking about in the previous question, the software features and the bandwidth per slot. So Force10 and Brocade both focus on the bandwidth within a particular line card. Okay? And they say this is where we think most people are spending their bandwidth. So they say within our line card, you can function at full line rate. That means 8 gig out, 8 gig in, or 16 gig total. You can go from port 1 to port 2 to port 3. You're going to get that full line rate. Cisco, on the other hand, says, I'm not convinced that people are always going to be working that way or always want to set up their SAN that way. So I'm going to give them that option too if they want to do that. But I'm going to focus on having offerings that are for for customers who really want high bandwidth between slots. So to give you an idea, Brocade gives you 256 gigs per slot. Cisco will go up as high as 512. And Force10, I'm not sure off the top of my head, but want to be sure, but I'm pretty sure it's 256 as well. Now again, within the slot, they all operate at full line speed, but between slots, they start to go down rapidly. So with 512, you could have 32 8 gig ports functioning at full line speed. So you could put 32, 32, 32, 32, 32, etc. And they would all communicate like they were in one giant switch that everything ran at full duplex 8 gig. Nobody else can do that. Brocade doesn't do that. Force10 doesn't do that. But that's why you pay for it. However, you might be in the camp that says, hey, I am going to be doing most of my switching between modules here, and I don't really need all that bandwidth between all these blades. Well, then these might be a good solution for you. Force10 was started actually by people from Cisco, so it has a lot of Cisco-like commands. You can think about Force10 like a combination between a Cisco and an HP. So an HP switch would do like VLAN tagging and vSANs, a little bit different than a Cisco does or a Brocade does, and that's what's going to be. It's going to be like over there in terms of just the actual command set. Cisco's going to be very similar to your other Cisco switches, which is why a lot of shops like them. Because they say, well, I've got Cisco Catalyst, and especially now Cisco Nexus. I've got Cisco Nexus in my data center already or in my server room. If you've already got Cisco Nexus, you already know how to use an MDS because the MDS runs Nexus OS. So that's another thing that's in common that people like about Cisco is that they can have a common image between their LAN switches and their SAN switches. Brocade has some lines that are like that as well. But the Brocade command set is completely different than a Cisco. And it's just a whole different logic. So if you're an all Brocade shop, you're thinking the same thing. I want to go with Brocade. Let's see, some other differences that I might want to think about. One of the things that you're going to want to look at is the kind of traffic that you're putting on the switches. So each of these switches can handle traffic a little bit differently. So Force10 really likes one type of traffic. My experience, I'm sure they'll probably say something different, but in my experience, they do the best. Their switches perform the best when you're putting one kind of traffic on it, meaning I'm putting all FCOE frames on it, or I'm putting all fiber channel protocol on it, or I'm putting all LAN traffic on it. I think that's when these guys work the best. I think when you start mixing multiple kinds of traffic on there, you start to see some latency. Now with Cisco's, again, I think it handles it much better, but it's at a much higher price point. So if that's important to you, if you're going to buy one switch and it's going to do everything, SAN, LAN, WAN, the whole deal, well, this might be more what you're looking for. And Brocade, again, is somewhere in the middle. So another question that you want to look at is how are you going to be using fiber and Ethernet? Are you going to be using some 10 gig? Are you going to be doing some iSCSI, some NFS, some CIFS? Are you going to be trying to mix those within the same module? So some of these, like Cisco, will have cards that can do both 8 gig and 10 gig in the same card. Force10 is going to go more along the lines of having one type per card. So it kind of depends on what you have, what you're looking for, and how can you start to look at, okay, this feature set matches this requirement, and start matching up your requirements to your features. That's going to tell you which solution is the best solution for you. I wish I had a full answer, Leanne, to be able to say, oh, I could just magically, ask you 3 questions and then automatically tell you which one's the best. I don't have that. So that's some of the main differences. There are a lot of other nuances I could get into that, I don't know if we have time, and maybe we can talk about it some other time. But I hope that helps, at least in part. So this is Dan with Storage Doc, and I hope you've found today's time informative. If you have any more questions, feel free to send them to us via email, and we'll be happy to look at them. So thanks, and until next time.
This podcast has been brought to you courtesy of Reliant Technology. Visit us online at www.reliant-technology.com.